and welcome to the Disability Connection. I'm your host, Barbara L'Italian. I'm the Executive Director of the Disability Law Center. The Disability Connection is produced by the Disability Law Center. We are the protection and advocacy agency for Massachusetts, part of a national network of disability rights agencies investigating abuse and neglect and providing legal representation and other advocacy services to people with disabilities. DLC's website is www.dlc-ma.org. Today, I am thrilled to be joined by Brianna Zimmerman, DLC's voting rights advocate. Hi, Brianna. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Brianna, could you tell us a little bit about your role at DLC?
Yeah, so as the voting rights advocate at DLC, I make sure that voting is accessible to people with disabilities across the state of Massachusetts. So I help people register to vote. I make sure that polling places are accessible for people with disabilities. And I also educate voters with disabilities about their voting rights. And so DLC receives protection and advocacy for voting access, otherwise known as PAVA funding from the federal government. And we are mandated by Congress to make sure that people with disabilities can participate equally in the electoral process. So that's my role at DLC.
Equal participation for people with disabilities seems really important. I'm really glad that you do that. Can you give us some examples of upcoming elections that you're aware of?
Yeah, so city level preliminary elections are actually happening in cities across Massachusetts at the end of August and in September.
So could you tell us a little bit about what is a preliminary election?
So preliminary elections are really used to narrow down the number of candidates before a general election. So, for example, if there are four candidates running for mayor, that will be narrowed down to two for the general election. And so voters really get to decide who the top two candidates are. That's just one example. Preliminary election dates are really decided individually by each town and city. Some cities don't even have preliminaries at all. For example, if they don't have a lot of people running for positions. And so some cities only have general elections. It's really up to the city, what date they hold their election.
Understood. So have any elections already happened this year for these types of elections?
Yeah, so the city of Woburn, interestingly, held their preliminary quite early on August 26th.
Okay. So I understand there's a couple of key dates coming up for preliminary elections. So let's break them down a little bit. Can you let us know which elections are happening on September 2nd?
Yeah, so Worcester is one of the cities that is having their preliminary on September 2nd.
And that's coming up really soon. That's the day after Labor Day. So people
Yeah.
really need to be aware of that. What's happening that following Tuesday on September 9th?
Yeah, so on September 9th, that's a really busy day for a lot of cities across Massachusetts. Boston, Springfield, and Lowell are some examples of cities that are having elections that day.
And then I've heard September 16th is also a date for some communities.
Yeah, so Brockton is one city that's holding elections September 16th. And that's just one example. There are a bunch more. You can always check the Secretary of State's website or your city or town's election department to confirm when your city's preliminary is. Because, like I said, it's a different date for every city.
So to be able to vote, my understanding is you need to be registered to vote. So when do people need to be registered to vote to be able to participate in these preliminary elections?
Yeah, that's a great question and super important to keep in mind. So people really need to be registered to vote 10 days before any election in Massachusetts, and that includes local elections as well. So for people whose towns are having elections on September 2nd, for example, the deadline to register unfortunately already passed on August 22nd. And then for the September 9th preliminaries, there's still a little bit of time. The deadline to register for September 9th would be Saturday, August 30th. And then for the September 16th preliminaries, the deadline is Saturday, September 6th. So again, 10 days before any election.
That's really important to know. Thank you. So how do people register to vote?
Yeah, so there are a few different ways that you can register to vote or check your registration status. So I always make sure to check if you're registered to vote first and make sure that all the information that is on your registration is correct. So, for example, if you've moved somewhat recently, if you've changed your name, anything like that, you should definitely check to make sure your registration is up to date. Sometimes people are even registered and they don't know. So just be sure to check that out first. You can check your registration status or register to vote for the first time online, by mail, or in person.
Okay, so let's break that down a little bit. What does the online registration process look like?
Sure. So to register online, you would go to the Secretary of State's website, and that's www.sec.ma.us/OVR. So you can go to that website to check your registration status, make sure everything's up to date, and even to register to vote. Uh, you will also want to make sure that you have a state ID issued by the Registry of Motor Vehicles if you're registering to vote on that website, though. If you do not have uh, an up-to-date ID from the RMV, then you could also vote by mail, register to vote by mail or in person.
So Brianna, can you tell us how you would register by mail?
Yeah, so you can register by mail by printing a voter registration form from the Secretary of State's website, and you can send it by mail to your local election office.
Okay, and what about if you wanted to go register in person?
So you can register in person at a few different places. You can go to your local election office, or you can actually go to one of the Secretary of State's office if that's more convenient.
That's interesting. Where are the Secretary of State's offices located?
Yeah, so fun fact, I only learned really recently that the Secretary of State doesn't only have offices in Boston, there's also offices in Springfield and Fall River. So those are their regional offices. So you can choose from one of those locations if that's more convenient than your local election office.
Okay, so uh, what types of offices will people be voting for in the local elections?
Yeah, so it depends on where you live. In many cities, mayor, school committee, and city council positions are up for election.
And why is it important to vote in these local elections?
Well, all of the people that we're voting for really play a role in local elections and deciding how city resources are spent. So, for example, they'll allocate resources and help to decide how the whole city is run, from city, police, fire departments, schools. They help to decide which sidewalks get repaired and, where or if affordable housing gets built. So these are things that really impact our communities directly on the local level. Even though local elections don't get a ton of attention, they have a huge impact on us personally.
Understood. Yeah. So you mentioned schools. Could you say a little bit more about what school committees do since they are on the ballot?
Yeah, so school committees help to decide how budgets for schools are spent. So where are your tax dollars going to? Are there going to be new teachers hired? Will there be a new gym, getting built or repaired? And they help to decide what students are taught, so what sorts of curriculum there is. So those are all really important things that impact, our youth.
Understood. And I think it's important to realize that some cities don't elect a school committee. I know that Boston does not. I don't believe that Lawrence does anymore. So you really have to check in with your locale to see whether or not school committee will be on your ballot. What about mayors? What do mayors do?
Yeah, that's a great point. So mayors propose budgets. They appoint people to lead different departments and sometimes supervise city departments. So one of the things that you just mentioned was that Boston doesn't vote for a school committee, but in some cities like Boston, school committee members get appointed, and sometimes mayors appoint people to the school committee. So mayors are really important because they have a say in who runs different departments, and they also get to decide, how laws are executed.
And also, what about city councilors? What do city councilors do?
Yeah, so city councilors pass local laws, which are also called ordinances on the city level, and they also pass city budgets. So mayors can propose budgets, but ultimately city councilors are sort of like a mini Congress. They get to decide really how, the budget is spent, and they get to pass these local laws, which also have a really big impact on members of their community.
Thank you for clarifying that. I think it's important for people to understand the role of school committee, city councilor, and mayor for city elections. Would you mind explaining the difference between a general and a preliminary election? So far, we've been talking about preliminary for August and September. When do general elections happen?
Yeah, so general elections happen after preliminary elections. And so in a preliminary, you're narrowing down the number of candidates that will run against each other in the general election. And in the general election, voters decide who actually wins an election. Again, some cities only have general elections when there's not a lot of people competing for one position. So across Massachusetts, 55 cities in Massachusetts, the general election day is Tuesday, November 4th. And so that is the election day for all of these cities. It's not like a preliminary election where it really varies by city. That will all be the same that first Tuesday in November.
Well, that's certainly easier to follow, right? That it'll be the first Tuesday in November, which happens to be November 4th, all across Massachusetts. So that's easier to remember. So could you talk a little bit about some of the different ways that people can vote?
Yeah, so you can vote by mail, in person, or if you have a disability that makes it hard to mark a ballot by yourself, you can vote accessibly online as well, which is really cool.
So could you tell us how voting by mail works?
So you'll need to fill out an application to vote by mail online at the Secretary of State's office at sec.state.ma.us. You can also print and mail the application at the Secretary of State's website. So just go and download the application, print and mail it. Or you can also go in person to your city election office for help. And if you need to use an online ballot because you have a disability, you can just select the option that says you need an accessible ballot.
So I know that some cities are opting out of vote by mail. So what if that's happened and your city has opted out and you can't make it to your polling place?
Yeah, so that's a good point. You should definitely check to make sure that your city has vote by mail available to everyone, not just people who have an excuse. So if your city has opted out of vote by mail, you can apply for an absentee ballot, which does require an excuse. For example, if you have a disability preventing you from voting at the polls, you'll be away out of town at the time of the election, or if you have some sort of religious belief preventing you from voting at your polling place on election day, you can apply for an absentee ballot. The only difference is that you need an excuse to qualify for one.
Okay. So could you now talk about what should people with disabilities know about our voting rights when voting in person?
Yeah, so you have the right to an accessible polling place, and that's according to state and federal laws and regulations. And you have the right to vote privately and independently. So this means that early voting locations and voting day polling locations should all be accessible.
So when you say polling places should be accessible, what exactly does that mean in terms of outside the polling place?
Yeah, so on the exterior of polling places, for example, uh, there should be signs marking accessible parking spaces. The accessible parking spaces should have a nice access aisle with enough room for a person with disabilities to exit their vehicle. And like I said, it should be marked clearly by signs, paint, or cones. It should be very obvious where the accessible parking is. And then also on the outside, there should be an accessible path of travel. So that means walkways, sidewalks, and parking lots that are all level and pretty flat and well lit. And signs should also direct voters to the accessible entrance so it's not confusing on where to go.
Great. So could you tell us a little bit about the inside of polling places? What makes an inside accessible?
Yeah, so as you're entering, doorways should be wide enough and they should be level without like having a large threshold that's hard to get over. And that's really for people using mobility devices like wheelchairs or walkers. There should be enough space also inside the polling place for people using mobility devices to maneuver. And at least one booth for marking paper ballots should be accessible. So that means that it should be low enough to the ground so that voters who are seated, for example, in wheelchairs or even walkers or chairs, can reach the writing surface and their wheels or their legs can fit underneath.
So can you tell us what kinds of machines can be used to help people vote, particularly those that have a hard time reading or filling out their ballot?
Yeah, so in Massachusetts, we have a machine called the Automark, and that machine helps you fill out your ballot. At least one Automark should be available at your polling place. And the Automark is really cool to use. I used one for the first time last year. It's super easy, in my experience. The Automark has a touch screen and it displays your ballot, and you can select your language, which is really great for people who are English language learners or their first language is not English. You can adjust the color and font size of your ballot on the screen. You can read aloud your ballot, and that requires headphones. And you can make selections using a keypad marked in Braille. And all of this is especially helpful to voters who have trouble reading or writing independently, including people who are blind, low vision, or people who have trouble gripping a pen, or people with disabilities that make it difficult to read by themselves.
So this is really interesting, this AutoMark machine. Is there a specific way that it should be set up?
Yeah, so like I said, there should be at least one functioning AutoMark machine at your voting location. It should be plugged in, turned on, and ready for voters to use. And the AutoMark should be privately located. So it shouldn't be facing other voters. People shouldn't be able to easily look over your shoulder and see who you're voting for. Um, Headphones should also be provided so that the ballot can be read out loud if you do need an audio ballot. And again, just like the accessible booth for marking paper ballots, if you need the auto mark, it should be placed in an accessible location. Wheelchair users should be able to fit behind the booth and underneath it, and they shouldn't have to reach up very high to mark their ballots.
So could you have someone help you vote if you wanted to?
Yeah, so poll workers should allow you to bring in a support person to help you vote. This could be pretty much anyone of your choice, like a friend, a family member, a neighbor, a caregiver, etc. However, the only caveat is that your helper cannot be your boss or employer or an agent representing your labor union if you're part of one. So it's important to know that no one can tell you how to vote as well. So whoever you choose, you should be comfortable with. Poll workers should also be able to help just in case you have any questions.
So you've done a great job of explaining accessibility. What happens if your polling place isn't accessible? What should you do?
Yeah, so if your polling place is not accessible, you should definitely ask to speak with the warden of your polling place, and that's the person who's really in charge of the polling location. They should be able to help you vote accessibly. If not, or if you would like to talk about your issues with someone higher up, you can also reach out to your local election office and speak directly to your city clerk or elections department. And also, you can contact Disability Law Center by visiting our website, www.dlc-ma.org, or call our intake line at 617-723-8455.
Great. Thank you so much, Brianna. It's been very, very helpful to explain all of this for folks, and hopefully we'll be able to boost up some participation in voting, which is really at the core of democracy. So that's our time for today. I thank you all for joining us and listening and learning. This show is available on our website and as a podcast. Please feel free to follow us on social media. And you can go to our website at www.dlc-ma.org for the links. Thank you so much.